Hi, this is a talk which I pre-recorded last year for the ATypI 2020 virtual conference. So this is a little bit different than the stuff I usually post on this channel. ATypI, or Association Typographique Internationale, is a non-profit organization that organizes an annual conference on typography and type design. So this talk is aimed more at an audience of other designers, but I tried my best to write it in a way that would make it accessible to a general audience. You can be the judge of how successful I was. This talk is the counterpart to my video on comedy club's symbolic tropes, and the focus here is on the history of typography in the branding of comedy clubs through history. It was very interesting going back over the historic stuff, and I want to give a special thanks to Rich Scheidner for sharing some of his personal archive with me for this video. And now, here's me from the past. Hi, thank you for joining. My name is Linus, and I want to start by asking you to flex your imagination and picture in your mind the style of typography that says neutral and professional. Got it? Chances are you thought of something like Frutiger or perhaps another humanist sans serif. Okay, imagine the typography of haute couture, premium, and luxury. Chances are you thought Comic Sans, right? I mean Dido or Bodoni. But really, what kind of type connotes humor? And no, I will not feature any type by Vincent Conner in this talk. Comedy has always been seen as a low form of art for the masses, and as such it hasn't received much cultural analysis. Today I want to dive deep into the visual culture of comedy, focusing on the typography of comedy club brands. As a graphic and type designer and former stand-up comedian myself, I've spent quite a lot of time musing on the subject, and not only whilst contemplating some monstrosity of a logo from the comedian's green room, though that may have been the genesis of this project. The very fact that this conference is taking place virtually speaks to the challenge that live entertainment venues of all stripes are facing in 2020. Sadly, a number of formative comedy venues have had to permanently close their doors this year, and the live comedy industry is grappling with an existential struggle. So it feels like a fitting moment to reflect, collect, and celebrate this aspect of comedy's visual history. For the sake of brevity, my focus is going to be mostly on the birthplace of stand-up, the United States, and we'll look at clubs from three distinct periods: the pioneers, the boom of the 1980s, and the 2000s alternative comedy boom. I can't hope to be comprehensive in this talk, but we will talk about some landmark venues and their influence and influences, as well as looking at the present and projecting forward to round things out. To set the scene, stand-up emerged as a new form of comedy distinct from that seen in vaudeville and other variety entertainments around the 1950s, but there were no dedicated comedy clubs until the 1960s. So if you wanted to see stand-up, you went into a nightclub or coffee shop, venues where you'd see a mix of music, poetry, and comedy. The Gaslight Cafe in Manhattan was a notable venue, and if you've watched the first series of The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, the character there performs at this real-life historic venue. Here in the Village Voice, amongst these venues, is where we see advertised the first ever venue which will later become a true comedy club: Bud Friedman's Improvisation Cafe. Originally, the logo is set in this fantastically 60s type, Caruso Roxy. Of course, the flower power aesthetic isn't influential in comedy, save for some of George Carlin's hippie phase, perhaps, and eventually the improv logo is changed to what we know today. This was revised around the time their second location was opened in Los Angeles in 1975, and this type, Piccadilly, had only just been released in 1973 by Letraset. It's very in the 70s zeitgeist, an Art Deco headline style reimagined as rendered by neon tubes. The Improv has become the largest comedy chain in the US, and they retain this now 45-year-old logo, which is impressive. Art Deco-inspired typography saw a huge revival in the 70s and 80s particularly, especially this style, Broadway, which was the basis for Piccadilly and other decorative variants. It was very popular across the entertainment industry. Note the extreme stroke contrast. There was a taste for pushing proportions and scale in fashion as well at the time, with huge collars and platforms shoes, so why not also in typography? Speaking of Broadway, here we see it again, this time for Catch a Rising Star. This was New York's other hugely influential club, helping launch the careers of Robin Williams, Chris Rock, Jerry Seinfeld, and many others. Now, the type for this branding changed a few times over the years, but eventually settled back on Broadway. But another element of this 70s typography is this rainbow arch. In fact, the arch and stars became so iconic during the peak of Catch's influence that other regional clubs would imitate their branding. But this didn't happen within a vacuum. Disco was huge in the 70s, and nightclubs, discos, and other nightlife venues loved this typographic convention. It was everywhere, and this really makes sense. The comedy club, as its own genre of entertainment venue, hadn't yet matured. If you said, let's go to the comedy club to somebody, they might not understand, and in fact, many early clubs called themselves comedy nightclubs for clarity in those days. So it made sense to look towards other nightlife venues for inspiration. Now, here are some venues which have, knowingly or not, followed in these footsteps. The Boarding House here being an exception. They were a primarily music venue which became a very important club in the San Francisco comedy scene around a similar time. But the Comedy Store in London, the UK's first comedy club, which opened much later, was clearly influenced. They wholesale just took the name and concept from the Comedy Store in Hollywood, so why not steal the look from New York? And speaking of duplicates, we have the Georgia punchline here, not to be confused with the punchline in San Francisco. Speaking of which, for contrast, here we have one of San Fran's early comedy institutions, the Holy City Zoo, with a look that's very California. It's more Art Nouveau than Deco, with a delightfully Victorian type called Milton, similar in character to Windsor, but with that high crossbar on the H and those angled counters on the capital O's. This aesthetic didn't really spread beyond San Francisco, though it does seem to fit the countercultural look of the era and the place. One exception being Cobb's Comedy Club, also in San Francisco, with its hand-lettered, Nouveau-inspired logo. Though the word order is a little difficult to scan, it is delightfully quirky. Also, on the West Coast, down in Los Angeles, the Comedy Store becomes the hub of stand-up in Hollywood for a generation. Now, the typography is distinctly evocative of the circus, though the Comedy Store never really settles on one canonical typeface. The facade and advertising and interior signage all use conflicting type styles alongside hand-rendered variants. But this ornate Tuscan-style lettering does evoke the circus, which is quite a different idea than evoking a nightclub or disco. The circus certainly had a kind of comedy, though clowning was very different to stand-up. It did immediately bring a sense of fun and family entertainment, and therefore it's a little bit less sophisticated than the East Coast examples. Now, as a typographic trope, this style was by far less influential, and that might have to do with the technology of the time. While the Deco typefaces of New York were very much of the photo typesetting era, this circus-style type was a throwback to the era of wooden type. The 19th century wood type styles like this were intended to be printed at huge sizes, but in the 1970s and 80s, comedy clubs would be advertised in small print ads in the newspaper, or use small flyers and handbills. So a lot of the ornament of these styles gets lost and muddied by the print technology of the time. So very few are inspired to imitate the store. You occasionally see this style for poster and album artwork, perhaps more during the digital type era than before, but it's still a relative rarity. By the mid-1970s, there were a handful of successful clubs around the US, but cable television alongside other new technologies poured fuel on the fire, and by the mid-1980s, comedy clubs started proliferating at a breakneck pace to try to keep up with demand. There was serious money to be made. Catch a Rising Star Incorporated raised $3.5 million in its initial public offering in 1987 and massively expanded its franchise. This became the era of corporate comedy, and with that establishment, we began to see tropes and conventions become entrenched. In this section, we'll look more at these tropes than at specific typefaces, and not all the examples will be from the 1980s comedy boom, but it was the boom that entrenched these cliches into the visual language. Another pioneering New York club was the comic strip Live. It was certainly a frontrunner in terms of this style, which became hugely popular in the boom era. Where the Comedy Store leaned on the circus for visual associations with comedy, the comic strip leaned on its namesake, particularly the daily or weekly comic strips from newspaper publishing. Now, stand-up comedy has about as much in common with cartooning as baseball has with golf. Yes, they both have something in common, a joke or a ball, but the skills and tools of the trade are completely different. But for some reason, this comic book lettering became a visual shorthand that was adopted by many clubs. This cartoony style hand lettering was extremely popular. An outlier here is the Pittsburgh Comedy Club, whose logo is set in brush script, but the Cheshire Cat mascot would sometimes appear in print ads, breaking the fourth wall and talking directly to the reader with a cartoon speech balloon. Fun. Also, Canada's biggest comedy franchise, Yuck Yucks, started with this very cartoony balloon lettering and now features a logo very reminiscent of one particular newspaper strip, with the letters slightly askew in that signature cartoon style. Which brings us to Zanies, also now a chain, but this logo was introduced somewhere around 1986, making it one of the earliest examples of this typographic convention. Without invoking comic book lettering, the Zanies logo takes the same rhythm of type, the alternating, randomly skewed lettering. The cartoon figures alongside the slogan make that inference that the letters are rolling around with laughter. It's like typographic onomatopoeia or visual slapstick. And just like slapstick, success is all about execution. Barrel of Laughs at Sinise's restaurant, also near Chicago, predates Zanies by over a year and has a suspiciously similar logo. But here we can see the breadth and depth that this convention has taken on over the years. We have some where only a single letter is off-kilter, like Just for Laughs and The Stress Factory, some modulating scale and proportion, like the Laughing Skull Lounge and the Boston Comedy Festival. We also have the oddly isometric design for Hiccups and the strangely slip-and-slide arrangement of PJ's Comedy Alley. This is only a small sample of brands playing with this idea, and there are many other variants, including the modulation of the bass line, letters remaining upright but jumping up and down. From the clumsy to the subtle, this is definitely the most successful meme in design to convey comedy typographically. Before we move on, I just want to show some oddballs from my research of this era. Dangerfields is more of a pioneering club, but that lettering is so odd. And it seems like they lifted the lettering from the cover of his comedy cookbook, which was apparently a thing. I also really have a soft spot for this logo type for giggles. What a unique take on having the laughing mouth trope, then expressing it through type. That's just good fun. Following the comedy boom, there was a bust. The market became saturated, and as a result, many comedy clubs folded. Comedy clubs continued, but for a growing number of audiences and comedians, mainstream comedy had become hack. This is the era of airplay and food jokes and lazy observations on gender and race, and eventually there was a reaction against this. Speaking of hack, this didn't really fit into any particular time period, but it felt wrong to leave out a word about skeuomorphic type. In particular, lettering made to look like neon lights or marquee letters studded with light bulbs. This practice predates the rise of desktop publishing and Photoshop, but those things certainly made it worse. Not too many major comedy clubs lean on it for their main branding, but it certainly became a cliche of amateur shows, flyer templates, etc. And I think I hate it so much because it cannot be any more literal. It speaks to an utter lack of imagination. And even with the budget of a major production company and the BBC, it still looks awful. So let's all agree to stop doing this. Finally, we catch up to the present day. After the low point of the 90s, a new generation of comics took a different approach to the now established comedy industry and self-produced shows which took place in alternative venues to the mainstream clubs. This was the birth of alternative comedy, at least in the American context. In some ways, it was going back to the earliest roots of stand-up in variety venues like nightclubs and coffee houses. Eventually, the style and aesthetic of alternative comedy became mainstream, and the most popular comedians with Netflix specials would be considered alt comics. Let's take a look at how this was reflected visually. A huge trend in the last 20 years has been the rise of a new long-form improv and its cross-pollination with the stand-up world. Improv schools and theaters had their own visual language, a lot of it inspired by activism and propaganda, which used visual cues like grunge textures and skewed typography, unlike the one we'd seen before where each letter is skewed, but rather where each line is askew, as if placed by a street artist working at speed. This was also a time where alternative spaces became preferred venues for certain styles of stand-up. These venues had very little shared visual language with the mainstream comedy clubs, and that was a bonus. Audiences were prepared to see something that didn't resemble the style of comedy in comedy clubs. Beyond the venues themselves, promotional materials for comedy changed drastically. The sketch show Mr. Show with David Cross and Bob Odenkirk leaned into surrealist animation, and underground comic creators like Daniel Klaus and R. Crumb. Comedians like Patton Oswalt and Brian Posehn were huge comic book nerds, and they commissioned illustrators who created posters for indie bands, which began creating original art for these alternative comedians, infusing them with references to nerd culture, as well as drawing from influences of earlier counterculture. This meant there was also a lot more hand-drawn lettering during this period, which became another signature element of the alternative comedy style. One influential comedy showcase from the last decade was The Meltdown with Jonah and Kumail. For this weekly show, illustrator Dave Klock made a new limited edition poster every week. You can see the eclectic influences on his style, and there is a vast range of hand lettering and typographic treatments. The brand here is held together simply by the artist's shared visual sensibility. These influences can be seen in print and in online promotional materials for alternative comedy shows across the country and around the world. There is a shared visual lexicon that is rooted in a DIY aesthetic. During the 2020 pandemic, there was a strong push toward live streaming shows, but the consensus has been that it cannot replicate the experience of live in-person comedy. The medium is still young though, and as it matures, comedians will find ways to exploit its strengths and avoid or downplay its relative weaknesses. But so far, we haven't seen any new trends emerge in the visual arena. I want to end with a quick look at a personal project. Back in 2010, I started a comedy night in London with another comedian, Barry Ferns, called Angel Comedy. My involvement has been minimal since 2012, and possibly because of that, this club has grown to be one of the leading independent clubs in the UK and the only one run by comedians. I slapped together a quick logo for a flyer back in 2010, and since then have occasionally gone back to overhaul the look and feel for the club, and this year I decided to take another stab at it. Typographically speaking, something I've not seen in my research has been deliberate juxtaposition. This is the visual analogy I've chosen for the club. Comedy is all about unexpected juxtaposition. I've chosen two beautiful variable font families that are complementary but contrast, both open source, and I highly recommend you check them out. For the club, my second inspiration has been street art and stickers, particularly layering of visual elements. The contrasting type styles here work as another layer in this visual style, which can be broken down into a kit of parts and recombined in different combinations. Where the prime medium of promotion in the old days was newsprint, now we have social media, and my design has grown out of the touch point of Instagram as the key stress test of the system. So I hope this overview has been of interest to you. I feel this has been a bit of a whirlwind tour. In summary, the visual evolution of type in comedy mirrors that of a successful comedian's career. At the beginning, you cannot help but wear your influences on your sleeve. Then when you find success, you develop a voice of your own style. And thirdly, once you become established, you must evolve past your own cliches to keep things fresh, and perhaps even dig deeper into your early roots. We're currently at a turning point for comedy, and a lot of things that I discovered for this talk may not be accessible in another 10 years. A lot has already disappeared. What makes live comedy special is its ephemerality. It can be recorded, but it's nothing like being there. Once the moment is over, it's gone forever. Unfortunately, much of comedy's visual history is also made up of ephemera, flyers, posters, and things which were never intended for posterity. Many have already been lost, but there's still a chance to capture this while it's still in living memory. Having said that, thank you to Rich Scheidner for sharing sources from his touring days during the 80s comedy boom. And if you wish to learn more about comedy history, I highly recommend the History of Stand-Up podcast. Please feel free to reach out to me via my website. I also make videos about design on YouTube for a mass audience, where I'll be posting a companion piece about the symbol and icon cliches of comedy as well. Thank you again for your time, and I hope to hear from you in the Q&A.